Hey, welcome back to the campfire. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time is it there. I want to see who's still with me through these stories. Now get cozy. It's time for another chilling tale. The rain hits the tent with gentle, persistent patter, almost soothing, if it weren't for memories it stirs. Do you hear that? The rain outside your window? It reminds me of that night. I've never told anyone the full story before. Perhaps telling you might help me make sense of it all, though I doubt it. Some experiences defy explanation, and what happened in those California woods 3 summers ago falls squarely into that category. I'd always considered myself a rational bloke, practical, not given to flights of fancy or superstition. I'm a software engineer from London who'd relocated to San Francisco for work. City born and bred, but I developed a fondness for the American outdoors since moving to California. There's something majestic about the wilderness here that we simply don't have back home. The sheer scale of it all, miles upon miles of untouched nature. That particular weekend, I planned a solo camping trip to a remote spot in the Sierra Nevada mountains. My colleagues thought I was balmy for going alone, especially as a foreigner who hadn't grown up exploring American wilderness. The bears will get you, they joked. If only it had been something as straightforward as bears. The campsite was called Whispering Pines, a name I initially found rather charming. It was about 4 hours' drive from San Francisco, tucked away in a densely forested area that promised spectacular views and peaceful isolation, perfect for clearing one's head after a stressful quarter at work. The weather forecast had predicted clear skies, but as I wound my way up the mountain roads, the clouds began to gather ominously. By the time I reached the ranger station to register my stay, fat droplets were already splattering against my windscreen. "You still heading up to Whispering Pines?" asked the ranger, a weatherman in his 60s with deep creases around his eyes. He glanced meaningfully at the darkening sky. "That's the plan," I replied, signing the visitor's log. "Unless you think I shouldn't?" He shrugged. "It's your call. Storm's coming in faster than expected. Might be a wet night." "I've camped in the rain before," I said with a confidence I didn't entirely feel. The ranger gave me a look I couldn't quite interpret. Site 27 is available. It's a bit further from the main camping area, but the view of the valley is worth it. He hesitated. "Just stick to the marked trails if you go hiking. People have been known to get turned around in these woods." I thanked him and continued driving up the winding road. The forest grew denser, the trees pressing in on either side like silent sentinels. The rain intensified, drumming on the roof of my rental car. My wipers struggled to keep up the downpour, and I slowed to a crawl, peering through the blurred windscreen for the turnoff to my campsite. The sign for Site 27 appeared suddenly in my headlights, a small wooden marker nearly obscured by overgrown brush. I almost missed it. The narrow access road was rough, jolting me in my seat as I navigated around potholes filled with rainwater. After about half a mile, the road opened into a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. My campsite. Despite the rain, I had to admit the ranger was right about the view. The clearing perched on the edge of a slope that fell away to reveal a vast valley below, now shrouded in mist and rain clouds. In better weather, it would have been breathtaking. Even in the storm, it had a wild, primeval beauty that made me glad I'd come. I sat in the car for a few minutes, watching the rain and gathering my determination. Then, in a flurry of activity, I erected my tent in record time, though not without getting thoroughly soaked in the process. I transferred my gear from the car, arranged my sleeping bag and supplies, and soon had a relatively dry haven established. The rain showed no signs of letting up as evening approached. I prepared a simple meal on my camping stove inside the tent vestibule and listened to the storm. The forest sounds were hypnotic. The drumming of rain on canvas, the occasional crack of branches in the wind, the distant hooting of an owl. Despite the weather, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. This was what I'd come for. Separation from the digital world, from deadlines and meetings and the constant ping of notifications. As darkness fell completely, I switched on my lantern and settled in with a paperback thriller I brought along. The golden light created a cozy atmosphere inside the tent, a small bubble of warmth against a wild night outside. I read for perhaps an hour before my eyelids began to grow heavy. The day's drive and setting up camp in the rain had tired me out. I was just about to turn off my light when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the forest's natural symphony. A whistle, a distinctly human whistle, carrying clearly through the rain and darkness. I froze, my book forgotten in my hands. The sound came again, a simple two-note pattern that seemed deliberately produced, not the random whistle of wind through trees, or some peculiar bird call. Someone was out there. Hello, I called, immediately feeling foolish. If someone was lost in the storm, they'd hardly hear me through the tent and rain. I unzipped the tent flap and peered out into the darkness. My small lantern cast a feeble glow that barely penetrated the curtain of rain. Beyond its light, the forest was an impenetrable wall of black. Is anyone there? I tried again, louder this time. No response came except for the steady patter of rain. I was about to retreat back inside when I noticed something odd, a faint light moving among the trees at the edge of my campsite, perhaps 50 yards away, too steady to be a reflection or a trick of my tired eyes. It looked like a flashlight, bobbing slightly as if carried by someone walking. My heart rate picked up. On one hand, it could be another camper who'd gotten lost in the storm. On the other hand, I was supposedly in one of the most isolated campsites in the area, and something about the situation felt decidedly off. Hello. I called again, louder still. Do you need help? The light stopped moving. For a long moment, it remained stationary, pointing in my direction. Then, without warning, it extinguished, plunging that section of forest back into darkness. A cold shiver ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the rain. I zipped the tent closed and sat back on my sleeping bag, suddenly very aware how exposed I was. Just a thin layer of nylon between me and whatever, or whoever, was out there. I'm not sure how long I sat there, listening intently for any sound that might indicate someone approaching. The rain continued its relentless drumming, occasionally punctuated by the groan of wind through the pines. Those trees, they made the strangest sounds in the wind, almost like whispers. Now I understood how the campsite got its name. Eventually, I convinced myself that I had imagined the whistle, that the light had been another camper who'd realized they'd strayed too close to an occupied site and respectfully retreated. I turned off my lantern and slipped into my sleeping bag, though sleep seemed a distant prospect. Despite my unease, exhaustion eventually won out. I drifted off to the sound of rain, only to be jolted awake sometime later. I couldn't tell how long I'd been asleep by a sound right outside my tent. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps circling my tent. I lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. The footsteps completed a circle around my tent and then stopped directly in front of the entrance. My heart hammered so loudly in my chest that I was certain whoever stood outside must hear it. Who's there? I managed to call out, my voice embarrassingly thin and reedy. No answer came, but I heard a faint sound, something that might have been breathing. Then the whistle again, the same two-note pattern I had heard earlier, only now it was mere feet away from where I lay. I fumbled for my torch, switching it on with trembling fingers. The beam cut through the darkness of the tent, and in that moment, I saw a silhouette against the nylon wall, the unmistakable outline of a human figure standing motionless outside. "What do you want?" I demanded, trying to sound authoritative despite the fear constricting my throat. The figure didn't move or respond. It just stood there, a dark shadow against my tent wall. And then, slowly, deliberately, it raised one hand. I watched, paralyzed, as a finger extended and pressed gently against the fabric of my tent, creating a small indentation that pointed directly at me. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us moved. Then the finger withdrew, and the silhouette stepped back from the tent. I heard footsteps retreating, moving back into the forest. I'd like to say I bravely unzipped the tent and confronted my nocturnal visitor, but the truth is I remained frozen in my sleeping bag, clutching my torch like a talisman until the first gray light of dawn filtered through the tent walls. Only then did I summon the courage to peek outside. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the forest dripping and misty. My campsite looked perfectly ordinary in the early morning light. No footprints, no signs that anyone had been there at all. Had I dreamed the whole incident? A nightmare brought on by unfamiliar surroundings and too many horror films? I wanted to believe that, but as I stepped outside to stretch my cramped muscles, something caught my eye. There, stuck to the outside of my tent where the mysterious figure had touched it, was a small pine needle, ordinary enough on its own. We were in a pine forest, after all, but this one was arranged in a very specific way, bent precisely in the middle to form a perfect V shape. It looked deliberately placed, not something that would have stuck there naturally in the wind or rain. I removed it carefully and examined it in the morning light. Just a pine needle. Nothing sinister about it. Yet my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I made a quick breakfast, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The forest that seemed so majestic yesterday now felt oppressive, the towering pines blocking rather than framing the view. I decided to go for a short hike, partly to clear my head, partly to convince myself that I was being ridiculous. The ranger's words echoed in my mind. Stick to the marked trails. The nearest trail began at the edge of my campsite, a narrow path marked with blue blazes painted on trees at regular intervals. It promised to lead to a scenic overlook about a mile away, perfect for a morning constitutional to settle my nerves. The forest was eerily quiet after the storm. No bird song, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush, just the occasional plop of water droplets falling from saturated branches. The trail was muddy but clear enough to follow, winding through stands of ancient pines whose branches interlaced overhead like gnarled fingers. I walked briskly, trying to focus on the natural beauty around me rather than the lingering unease from the night before. The exercise helped, and by the time I reached the overlook, a rocky outcropping that provided a spectacular view of the mist-shrouded valley, I had almost convinced myself that I'd imagined the whole incident. The view was worth the hike. The morning sun was burning through the clouds, creating dramatic shafts of light that pierced the mist hovering over the valley floor. I stood there for a long while, breathing in the clean, pine-scented air and feeling my anxiety gradually dissipate. It was as I turned to head back that I noticed them, small V-shaped arrangements of pine needles placed at intervals along the path I'd just traveled. I hadn't seen them on my way up. I was certain of it. Each was identical to the one I'd found on my tent, bent carefully at the middle to form that perfect V-shape. They created a line leading directly back to my campsite. Someone had followed me and then preceded me back. Suddenly, the relative peace I'd achieved evaporated. I hurried down the trail, no longer admiring the scenery, but scanning the forest around me for any sign of movement. The silence that had seemed peaceful now felt pregnant with malice. I could have sworn I caught glimpses of something moving parallel to the trail, just at the edge of my vision, but whenever I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. When I finally reached my campsite, everything appeared undisturbed. My tent stood exactly as I'd left it. My car sat placidly where I parked it. Yet something felt different, wrong somehow. It took me a moment to identify what had changed. There was a smell in the air that hadn't been there before, a faint, unpleasant odor beneath the clean scent of pine and wet earth. Something acrid and unmistakably human. The smell of unwashed bodies, of stale sweat, and something else I couldn't quite identify. I approached my tent cautiously. The entrance flap that I'd left partially unzipped was now fully closed. Had I done that without thinking? I couldn't remember. With a growing sense of dread, I reached for the zipper. My hand was shaking so badly that it took 3 attempts to grasp the small metal pole. Slowly, I drew it upward, creating an opening just large enough to peer inside. The interior of the tent looked exactly the same. Sleeping bag neatly laid out, my book placed beside it. Camping stove stored in the corner. Everything in its place, except for one thing. In the center of my sleeping bag lay another pine needle, bent into that now familiar V shape. Someone had been inside my tent while I was gone. Someone had been watching me, following me, entering my temporary home. I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was no longer a situation I could rationalize away or ignore. I needed to leave immediately. I threw my gear haphazardly into my backpack, not bothering with the careful organization I usually prided myself on. The tent I left standing. It wasn't worth the time it would take to dismantle it. All I wanted was to get back to my car and drive away from this place as quickly as possible. As I tossed my backpack into the passenger seat and slid behind the wheel, a flicker of movement caught my eye. There, at the edge of the clearing where the forest began, stood a figure. It was too distant to make out clearly, just a dark silhouette partially hidden by a massive pine trunk. But I could feel its gaze fixed on me with palpable intensity. I fumbled with my keys, nearly dropping them in my haste. The engine roared to life, and I reversed so quickly that mud sprayed from beneath my tires. As I swung the car around toward the access road, my headlights briefly illuminated the spot where the figure had stood. It was gone, but where the empty space between trees had been, I now saw something that made my blood run cold. A line of people, 5 or 6 of them, standing motionless among the pines, their features indistinct in the shadows, all watching me. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, no longer care about the rough road or what damage it might do to the rental car. The vehicle bounced violently as I sped down the narrow track, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. In my rear view mirror, I caught a final glimpse of my abandoned tent, now looking absurdly vulnerable and small against a vast, dark forest. The journey back to the ranger station passed in a blur of adrenaline and fear. When I finally pulled up outside the small wooden building, I was trembling so badly that I had to sit for a moment before I could trust myself to walk. The same ranger was on duty, looking up with mild surprise as I burst through the door. "Heading out already?" he asked, glancing at his watch. "You just got here yesterday evening." There were people in the woods. I blurted out. At my campsite, someone followed me on the trail, got into my tent. The ranger's expression shifted subtly. "Did you see anyone clearly?" Get a description? I shook my head. Just figures in the trees. And these strange markers made from pine needles bent into V shapes, left on my tent along the trail on my sleeping bag. Something flickered in the ranger's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or concern, but his voice remained level when he spoke. We get all sorts up in these mountains. Probably just some locals having a laugh with the foreign camper. He pulled out a form from beneath the counter. Want to file an official report? I can call the sheriff if you feel threatened. Did I feel threatened? Absolutely. But something in the ranger's manner made me hesitate. There was an undercurrent I couldn't quite identify. Not dismissal exactly, but a certain resignation, as if he'd heard similar stories before. These locals, I said carefully, do they make a habit of terrorizing campers at Whispering Pines? The ranger's eyes met mine for a long moment. Then he sighed, pushing the form aside. Look, he said, lowering his voice slightly, though we were the only ones in the building. Whispering Pines has always been different. Most tourists stick to the main campground areas down by the lake. Sites like 27, the remote ones, they attract a different crowd. What kind of crowd? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. There's stories, he said vaguely. Old stories about those parts of the forest. Native American legends about spirits that whisper among the pines, that take forms that aren't quite human. He shrugged, as if embarrassed by his own words. Just superstition, obviously. But some of the locals take those legends seriously. Some say they've seen things up there. Things like, what? My mouth had gone dry. Figures that follow hikers but never show themselves clearly. Strange markers left as warnings or messages. Whistling in the night. He gave me a pointed look. Sound familiar? I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. And you still send campers up there? It's public land, he said simply. I can't stop people from going where they want to go. And most visitors never report anything unusual. Just the occasional one, like you. He paused. Did they harm you? Damage your property? No, I admitted. But then my advice is to chalk it up to an unsettling experience and move on. These mountains keep their secrets. Some things are better left unexplained. I left the ranger station more disturbed than when I'd entered it. His cryptic responses had done nothing to alleviate my fear. If anything, they deepened it. I drove straight back to San Francisco that day. The memory of those silent figures among the trees haunted me all the way. In the weeks that followed, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Perhaps it had been local teenagers playing tricks on the foreign camper, as the ranger suggested. Perhaps I'd allowed my imagination to transform ordinary forest noises and shadows into something sinister. But I couldn't explain away that perfect V-shaped pine needle on my sleeping bag. I couldn't forget the unmistakable sensation of being watched, followed, studied by unseen eyes. I researched Whispering Pines obsessively, searching for similar reports or local legends that might explain my experience. What I found was disturbing in its paucity, occasional vague references to strange occurrences in that region of the Sierra Nevada, a few obscure forum posts describing experiences unnervingly similar to mine, all seemingly dismissed or rationalized away. It was as if something was deliberately keeping these stories from spreading too widely. One account in particular chilled me to the bone. A hiker claiming to have photographed one of the forest people near Whispering Pines. The image, blurry and dark, showed a humanoid figure standing among dense pines. Its proportions were subtly wrong. Limbs too long, head slightly misshapen. In one elongated hand, it held what looked like a bent pine needle. The post had been removed within hours of being published. When I tried to contact the user who'd shared it, I found the account had been deleted 3 months after my experience. I received a small package at my flat. No return address. Postmarked from a town near the Sierra Nevada mountains. Inside was a single pine needle, bent perfectly into a V shape. I moved back to London the following week. Do you hear the rain outside? Listen carefully. Can you distinguish the water droplets from footsteps? Would you know if someone was circling your home right now, watching, waiting? Sometimes when it rains like this, I imagine I hear that two-note whistle again. And I wonder, did I leave something behind in those woods? Or did something from those woods follow me home? Perhaps you're thinking I'm simply a man with an overactive imagination who had a strange experience while camping alone. Perhaps you're right. But listen to me carefully. If you ever find yourself in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California and someone suggests a remote campsite called Whispering Pines, particularly Site 27, turn around. Drive away. Don't look back. And if you hear whistling in the rain, pretend you don't notice. They're drawn to those who acknowledge them. I've said too much already. The rain is getting heavier now, isn't it? Or is that the sound of footsteps approaching? Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. Sleep well tonight. And perhaps check your windowsill in the morning for a small, bent pine needle in the shape of AV. We're all being watched. The only difference is that some of us know it. The rain against my window reminds me of that sound. Water droplets hitting canvas. A rhythmic patter that once brought comfort, but now only resurrects terror. Are you listening to the rain too? Does it make you feel safe, cocoon in your home? Or does it stir something primal in you? A fear of what might be moving under its cover? I found the first story 5 months ago. A British man's account of something he encountered at a place called Whispering Pines in California. Most people dismiss it as fiction, just another creepy tale shared online to frighten gullible readers. But I recognized the truth in his words immediately. The bent pine needles, the whistling, the figures that watch from the tree lean. I recognized it because I'd been there too, though I'd never spoken of it. Not until now. My name is Eliza Winters. I'm a doctoral student in cultural anthropology at Berkeley, specializing in folklore and rural American mythologies. 3 years ago, I was researching indigenous legends of the Sierra Nevada region for my dissertation. That's what brought me to Whispering Pines. Unlike the British man, I went there deliberately, drawn by the whispers of strange occurrences and local superstitions that surrounded the area. Academic curiosity. It seems laughable now how clinical and detached I was, imagining I could study such things without becoming entangled in them. I'd interviewed several residents of nearby towns, collecting fragmented stories about the deep woods around Whispering Pines. They spoke of the Watchers, entities that were neither human nor animal that had supposedly inhabited the forest since before European settlement. Most locals avoided the area, particularly Site 27 and the surrounding ridge. Bad medicine. An elderly man at the local diner had told me, refusing to elaborate further. The ranger station was my last stop before heading up to the campsite. The ranger, a weathered man in his 60s, seemed unsurprised when I mentioned my research. Academic, are you? He asked, checking my permit. Coming to poke around our local ghost stories? Something like that. I replied, trying to gauge whether he was mocking me. I'm particularly interested in the legends surrounding Whispering Pines. He studied me for a long moment. Site 27 available, he finally said. Best view in the area. Also the most isolated. Perfect, I said, not recognizing the warning in his words. The drive up was uneventful, though I noticed how the forest seemed to close in around my car as I climbed higher, the trees growing denser and more ancient. It was late afternoon when I reached a small sign marking the turnoff for Site 27. The dirt road was rough and narrow, winding deeper into the woods before opening into a clearing perched on the edge of a steep slope. The view was spectacular. The vast valley spread out below, trees stretching endlessly to the horizon. I set up my tent methodically, arranged my research materials, and prepared for my first night of field observation. I had recording equipment, cameras, notebooks, all the tools of a serious researcher. I felt prepared, protected by my academic detachment and scientific methodology. How naive I was. The rain began just after sunset, a gentle patter that quickly intensified into a steady downpour. I retreated to my tent, pleased with the weather. Rain often amplifies paranormal activity. According to folklore, if there was anything to observe at Whispering Pines, the conditions were perfect. I sat cross-legged in my tent, recording audio notes about the environment, the local stories I collected, my methodological approach. I was mid-sentence when I heard it, a clear, two-note whistle cutting through the rain. I paused my recorder, listening intently. The sound came again, closer this time. My heart quickened, though I told myself this was exactly what I'd come to document. I switched my recorder back on. Time is approximately 9:47 p.m. I dictated. Distinct whistling sound from the northwest edge of the campsite. Two-note pattern, deliberate rather than naturally occurring. I unzipped my tent and peered out into the darkness, my torch beam cutting a weak path through the rain. Nothing visible. I stepped out fully, protected somewhat by my waterproof jacket, and swept the light along the tree line. There, a brief reflection caught in my beam. Two reflections, actually about 6 feet off the ground in space like eyes. Hello, I called, my voice surprisingly steady. Is someone there? No answer came, but the reflections didn't disappear. They remained fixed, unblinking, watching me from the darkness between the trees. I raised my camera and snapped several photos in quick succession, the flash momentarily illuminating the forest edge. In that stark white light, I caught a glimpse of something that sent ice through my veins, a tall, thin silhouette, partially hidden behind a tree trunk. It was shaped like a person, but the proportions were wrong somehow. The limbs too elongated, the head slightly misshapen. When the flash faded and my eyes readjusted to the darkness, the reflective eyes were gone. I retreated to my tent, hands trembling as I downloaded the photos to my laptop. Most showed nothing but rain-blurred darkness, but one, the third shot, captured something. A pale, elongated figure, its features indistinct, but its posture unmistakably attentive, watching me. I told myself this was good evidence, data for my research, but the academic part of my brain was rapidly losing ground to a more primitive instinct that screamed danger. The whistle came again, now from a different direction. Then another answered from the opposite side of the clearing. Then a third. They were surrounding my campsite. I switched off my torch and sat in darkness, listening as the whistles called to each other. There was a pattern to them, almost like communication. I fumbled for my recorder, determined to capture sounds even as fear clawed at my throat. Multiple sources now. I whispered into the device. Positioned around perimeter of Site 27. Communication pattern suggests. A sudden thump against the side of my tent cut me off. Something had struck the fabric. Not hard, but deliberately. I froze, barely breathing, as a slow scraping sound moved along the tent wall. It circled once, twice, then stopped at the entrance. For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, something pressed against the tent fabric, the distinct impression of a hand, but with fingers too long and too numerous to be human. I bit down on my fist to keep from screaming. The impression remained for several seconds, then withdrew. The whistling had stopped. In its place came a new sound, a low, sibilant whispering that seemed to emanate not from one source, but from everywhere at once. I couldn't make out words, exactly, but the cadence was language like rising and falling in distinct patterns. It reminded me of the rustling of pine needles and wind, but organized, purposeful. The whispering continued through the night. I didn't sleep. I sat clutching my recorder and torch, documenting everything in a voice that grew increasingly strained. At some point, I realized I was no longer acting as a researcher. I was a witness, a potential victim. Dawn came with merciful slowness. The rain had stopped, and with it, the whispering. When I finally gathered the courage to unzip my tent, the clearing looked perfectly ordinary in the gray morning light. Peaceful, even, but there, arranged in a perfect circle around my tent, were dozens of pine needles, each bent carefully into a V shape. I should have left immediately. Any rational person would have. But I was still clinging to my research identity, telling myself this was a significant folkloric find. I photographed the pine needles, collected several as specimens, and made detailed notes about their placement. Then I noticed something odd about the tree nearest my tent. A tall, ancient pine with bark so dark it was almost black, at about eye level. Something had been carved into the trunk. It looked fresh. The exposed inner was still oozing sap. It was a crude representation of a human figure with a tent, surrounded by tall, elongated forms. My hands shook as I photographed the carving. This was no longer just folklore. This was a threat or a warning. I decided to hike down to the ranger station, ostensibly to inquire about local plant specimens, but really to put some distance between myself and the campsite. I followed the blue blaze trail that wound down the mountainside, constantly glancing over my shoulder, unable to shake the sensation of being watched. About half a mile from the campsite, I realized the forest had gone completely silent. No bird song, no rustling leaves, no scurrying creatures in the underbrush. Just a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. I quickened my pace, no longer even pretending to conduct field observations. The trail curved sharply around a massive boulder, and as I rounded a bend, I came to an abrupt halt. Standing directly in the middle of the path was a slim, pale object stuck vertically into the ground. As I approached cautiously, I saw it was a stack of pine needles, dozens of them, all bent into V shapes and arranged in precise tower about 2 feet high. It was so obviously artificial, so deliberately placed that it took my breath away. I circled the strange instruction, noting that it cast a shadow pointing directly back toward my campsite. A marker, a sign. When I looked up from the pine needle tower, I saw them. They stood among the trees on either side of the trail, tall, motionless figures partially obscured by pine trunks and shadows. I couldn't count them precisely, maybe 7 or 8, but they formed a loose semicircle ahead of me, blocking my path to the ranger station. I raised my camera with trembling hands and took several photos. Through the viewfinder, I could see them more clearly. They were humanoid but wrong. Too tall, too thin. Their limbs jointed in places human limbs shouldn't bend. Their faces were obscured by shadow, but their eyes caught the light with that same reflective quality I'd noticed the night before. I lowered the camera slowly. None of the figures had moved. "What do you want?" I called, surprising myself with my boldness. The forest answered with absolute silence. Not even my voice seemed to echo properly. Then, as if responding to some signal I couldn't perceive, all the figures took one synchronized step forward, emerging partly from their concealment behind the trees. I ran, abandoning all pretense of academic courage. I turned and fled back up the trail toward my campsite. I could hear movement in the forest around me. Not footsteps exactly, but a rushing sound, like wind through branches, but more directed, more purposeful. They were pursuing me, moving parallel to the trail, keeping pace without difficulty. I burst into my campsite clearing, lungs burning, and scrambled for my car keys. My research equipment could stay. All I wanted was to escape. But as I reached my car, I saw something that stopped me cold. Every window was decorated with carefully placed V-shaped pine needles, arranged in concentric circles that covered the glass completely. The amount of time and precision this would have taken was staggering. They had been busy while I was on the trail. With shaking hands, I brushed the pine needles from the driver's side window. They fell away easily enough, but left behind tiny dots of clear sap where they had been attached, forming the same pattern on the glass. I threw myself into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I began to reverse, something caught my eye, movement at the edge of the clearing. They stood there, a line of impossible figures emerging from between the trees. In the daylight, I could see them more clearly, and the sight defied everything I understood about anatomy and biology. They were vaguely human-shaped but stretched and distorted, their skin the same dark color as pine bark, their limbs too numerous and wrongly articulated. Their faces were smooth and featureless except for those reflective eyes and what might have been mouths, vertical slits that now opened in unison. The whistling began again, not from any one figure, but from all of them together, producing a harmony that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. I floored the accelerator, the car bouncing violently down the rough access road. In my rear-view mirror, I could see the figures remaining at the edge of the clearing, watching me flee. The ranger seemed unsurprised when I skidded to a stop outside the station, wild-eyed and babbling about what I'd seen. He listened calmly, then asked a question that chilled me more than the entities themselves had. "Did you record any of the whistling or whispering?" I nodded mutely and fumbled for my digital recorder. With shaking hands, I pressed play. Static. Nothing but static where there should have been my voice. The rain, the whistling, the whispering. Hours of documentation. Gone. The ranger nodded as if this confirmed something. "And your photos?" I pulled out my camera, suddenly knowing what I would find. Every image was corrupted. Strange digital artifacts obscuring what should have been clear evidence of entities. "They don't like being documented," the ranger said quietly. "Never have." "What are they?" I whispered. He shook his head. "Been working these woods 30 years, and I still don't rightly know. Locals have different names for them. The Watchers, the Listeners, the People of the Pines." He paused. "They've always been here, long before us. They generally leave folks alone unless provoked." Provoked? My voice was barely audible. I was just taking pictures. Recordings? That's provocation to them, he said simply. They value their privacy. You should warn people. I said, anger briefly overcoming my fear. You should close that campsite. Public land. He replied with a shrug that seemed rehearsed. Can't stop people from going where they want to go. Besides, most visitors never notice anything unusual. He gave me a significant look. Only certain people attract their attention. What kind of people? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. People looking for them, he said. People with cameras and recorders and journals, coming to study them like specimens. His eyes held mine. People like you, Dr. Winters. A chill ran through me. I never told you I was a doctor. His expression didn't change. You didn't have to. I left the ranger station with more questions than answers, drove straight back to Berkeley, and tried to forget what I'd experienced. I buried myself in less controversial research, eventually completing my dissertation on mainstream Appalachian folk practices instead of the Sierra Nevada legends that had originally fascinated me. For 3 years, I told myself that my experience had been some kind of elaborate hoax, or perhaps a stress-induced hallucination. I even managed to convince myself that the ranger had been part of a local effort to perpetuate tourism-driving myths. Then I found a British man's account online, describing the exact same phenomena at the exact same location. The whistling, the watchers, the V-shaped pine needles. His experience mirrored mine in too many specific details to be coincidence. I tracked him down, sent him a carefully worded email explaining my own encounter at Whispering Pines. His reply was brief. They found you again. I'm sorry. 2 days later, I discovered the first pine needle on my apartment windowsill, bent perfectly into the shape of a V. They've appeared daily since then. No matter how carefully I locked my doors and windows, no matter how many times I moved, always in places I recently touched, my computer keyboard, my toothbrush holder, my pillow. Last night, I heard the whistling again, that same two-note pattern, coming from the street below my apartment. When I looked out, there was a figure standing under the street lamp. Too tall, too thin, looking up at my window with reflective eyes. It raised one elongated hand and pressed a finger to where its mouth should be, a gesture of silence. I understand now why the British man moved back to London, why he tried to put an ocean between himself and Whispering Pines. But I also understand something he perhaps hasn't realized yet. Distance doesn't matter to them. Once they found you, once they marked you as an observer, they never really let you go. I'm leaving this account as a warning. If you hear about a campsite called Whispering Pines, specifically Site 27, stay away. If you hear whistling in the woods or at night outside your window, don't acknowledge it. If you find pine needles bent into V shapes, don't touch them and certainly don't collect them. Above all, if you're ever in the forest of the Sierra Nevada and feel like you're being watched, you're right. You are. But if you're smart, you'll pretend you don't notice. Pretend you don't see the figures among the trees. Pretend you don't hear the whispering. Academic curiosity is a luxury for those who've never encountered things that exist beyond the boundaries of human understanding. I sacrifice that luxury at Whispering Pines. The rain is getting heavier now. Can you still hear it against your window? Are you sure it's just raindrops? Listen carefully. That rhythm, is it entirely natural? There, did you hear that whistle? They know you're listening to this story. They know you're thinking about them now, and they're curious about you too. Still with me? If you're enjoying these campfire tales, let me know by leaving a like. That way, I'll know you want more stories, and maybe even darker ones next time. Let's keep the fire burning. The rain reminds us that some secrets are better left buried, doesn't it? Do you hear it tapping against your window? Gentle but persistent? It sounds almost like fingertips, doesn't it? Like something trying to get your attention? I found their stories by accident. A British software engineer's terrifying account of Whispering Pines. followed by an anthropologist named Eliza Winters who'd experienced similar phenomena. Most would dismiss them as creative fiction, but I recognized the truth immediately. The bent pine needles, the whistling, the watchers in the trees. I knew because I've been the one to send them there. My name is Dr. Marcus Sullivan. For 15 years, I worked as a lead research scientist for a classified government program investigating anomalous phenomena in Northern California. What I'm about to share will cost me my career, possibly my freedom, and maybe even my life. But the public needs to know what's happening at Whispering Pines. Our program began in 2007 after multiple reports of strange encounters in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Hikers disappearing, rangers describing impossible creatures, local tribes refusing to enter certain areas of the forest. The government wanted to understand what was happening, not to protect people, mind you, but to assess whether the phenomena could be studied, perhaps even weaponized. We established a research outpost near Whispering Pines, disguised as an environmental monitoring station. The ranger you've met in the previous accounts, the older man with weathered features, was one of ours, positioned to keep civilians away while directing select individuals towards Site 27. Individuals like the British man and Dr. Winters. You see, we needed fresh observers, people who wouldn't know what to expect. Their genuine reactions and experiences provided our most valuable data. I'm not proud of this. Using unknowing civilians as research subjects violated every ethical standard I once held dear. But at the time, I justified it through scientific necessity. What we were studying at Whispering Pines defied conventional understanding. We needed multiple perspectives, multiple encounters documented. For years, we monitored Site 27 and the surrounding forest. We installed cameras and recording equipment, motion sensors, and thermal imaging devices. Most failed spectacularly whenever the phenomena manifested. Equipment would malfunction, batteries would drain, recordings would show nothing but static. But gradually we began to understand. The entities, we call them sentinels internally, weren't supernatural in the traditional sense. They existed simultaneously in our world and somewhere else. Their physical forms seemed to fluctuate between states of matter, becoming most solid and visible during rainfall or high humidity. They communicated through subsonic frequencies, hence the whispering that human ears interpreted as wind through pine needles. The V-shaped pine needles were markers, territorial signifiers. When they appeared around a campsite or on a person's belongings, it meant that individual had been noticed by the sentinels. And once you were noticed, you were never truly free of them again. We lost our first researcher in 2009. Dr. Abigail Chun, brilliant physicist, spent 3 nights at Site 27 gathering data. On the 3rd night, after a particularly heavy rainstorm, she reported via radio that she could see figures surrounding her tent. "They're communicating," she whispered. "I can almost understand them." Those were her last words to us. When our recovery team arrived at dawn, her tent was empty. No signs of struggle, no equipment damaged. Just dozens of V-shaped pine needles arranged in concentric circles where her sleeping bag had been. We should have shut everything down then. Reported Chun as missing, closed the site, walked away. But the data we collected from her final transmission was revolutionary. The subsonic patterns the sentinels emitted appeared to alter the fundamental properties of matter in their vicinity. The military applications were immediately obvious, so we continued. We refined our approach, establishing safety protocols. Researchers would work in pairs. No one would remain at Site 27 for more than 48 hours. Direct interaction with the Sentinels was expressly forbidden. For a while, this worked. We gathered valuable data while maintaining a safe distance. But the Sentinels were learning too. They began to recognize our patterns, our equipment, our people. They became more assertive in their interactions, more deliberate in their manifestations. In 2013, I personally witnessed a Sentinel for the first time. I was conducting routine maintenance on our equipment at Site 27. A quick daytime visit that should have been perfectly safe according to our established patterns. The day was clear, sunny, no rainfall for over a week. I was checking a motion sensor when I noticed the silence. The forest sounds, birds, insects, wind had completely ceased. The air felt suddenly dense, as if the atmospheric pressure had increased dramatically. When I turned, it was standing at the edge of the clearing, at least 7 feet tall and possibly thin. Its body the dark color of wet pine bark. Its proportions were wrong in ways that hurt to look at directly, joints bending at impossible angles, fingers too numerous and too long. Its face, if you could call it that, was smooth except for those reflective eyes and a vertical slit where a mouth should be. It didn't move as I stared, transfixed with equal parts scientific fascination and primal terror. Then, slowly, it raised one elongated hand. Between 2 impossible fingers, it held a pine needle bent perfectly into a V shape, a marking, a message, a claim. I remained frozen until a sound broke the silence. A sharp, 2-note whistle from deeper in the forest. The entity turned toward the sound, then back to me. The vertical slit on its face widened, revealing not teeth or a tongue but a darkness that seemed to absorb light. It whistled back, the same 2-note pattern, and suddenly the forest was full of answering whistles coming from all directions. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. I ran, professional detachment forgotten, scientific curiosity abandoned. I fled to my vehicle and drove recklessly down the mountain road. When I reached our research station, I was trembling so badly I could barely speak. That night, I found the first V-shaped pine needle on my pillow in the secure dormitory. The next morning, another appeared on my toothbrush, then on my keyboard, my coffee cup, the classified files on my desk. I wasn't just being observed. I was being haunted. The project director dismissed my concerns, attributed my experience to stress and overwork. He ordered me to take a week's leave. When I returned, I found the research had advanced in a disturbing new direction. They were now attempting direct communication with the Sentinels. Dr. Robert Kendrick, our linguistics expert, had developed a theory that the whistling patterns represented a form of language. He created an algorithm to analyze the patterns and began broadcasting synthetic whistles at Site 27, attempting to elicit responses. The responses came, but not in ways we anticipated. 3 days after initiating the communication attempt, every pine tree within a 5-mile radius of Site 27 was found bent into unnatural positions. Their trunks twisted to form enormous V-shapes visible from satellite imagery. Trees that had stood for centuries, some with trunks 3 feet in diameter, bent like saplings. That same night, all 7 researchers at the station reported the same dream. Standing in a vast, dark forest unlike any on Earth, surrounded by tall, silent figures that seemed to be waiting for something. Upon waking, each researcher discovered a single pine needle on their chest, directly over their heart. The project director remained undeterred. This proves communication is possible, he insisted. We're making breakthrough progress. 2 nights later, Dr. Kendrick disappeared from his locked room at the research station. The security footage showed nothing just static for 3 minutes, then an empty room. On his computer screen, left open and powered on, was a single sentence typed into a blank document. They are not yours to study. The remaining team was divided, some terrified and demanding the project be terminated. Others intrigued by what they saw as first contact with a non-human intelligence. The project director sided with the latter group, arguing that whatever the Sentinels were, understanding them was crucial to national security. I found myself caught in the middle, scientifically fascinated, but increasingly disturbed by our methods and the entity's growing boldness. The pine needles continued to appear in my personal spaces. No matter how carefully I secured my room, no matter what precautions I took. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of elongated silhouettes at the periphery of my vision, gone when I turned to look directly. One night, unable to sleep, I reviewed our accumulated data and noticed something we'd all missed, a pattern in the disappearances, the dreams, the manifestations. They were increasing not just in frequency, but in geographical spread. What had once been contained to the immediate vicinity of Site 27 was now affecting areas up to 20 miles away. The Sentinels weren't just responding to our presence. They were expanding their territory. Our attempts to study them had triggered something, awakened something that had previously been dormant or contained. I took my concerns to the project director the next morning. He listened silently, then opened his desk drawer and removed a small wooden box. Inside, carefully arranged, were dozens of V-shaped pine needles. "They've been appearing in my home," he said quietly. 30 miles from here, in my daughter's bedroom, in my wife's car. His hands trembled slightly. "Yesterday, my 8-year-old daughter told me about the tall tree people who watch her from the garden at night, who whistle to her when everyone else is asleep." For the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. What have we awakened, Sullivan? Within 24 hours, the termination order came down from the highest levels. The research station was to be evacuated, all equipment removed, all data secured. Site 27 was to be permanently restricted under the cover story of environmental contamination. As we packed up our research, one of our junior scientists made a disturbing observation. We had never found any physical evidence of the Sentinels. No tissue samples, no clear photographs, nothing tangible that proved their existence beyond our personal experiences and the V-shaped pine needles. "What if we're not observing them?" he suggested. "What if our observation is creating them? What if belief itself is a catalyst?" It was an unsettling theory that none of us wanted to consider. If true, it meant that by studying the phenomena, by believing in the Sentinels, we had given them form and power. Every person who encountered them, who believed in their existence, strengthened them somehow, including you now as you listen to this account. The evacuation proceeded rapidly. By sunset, the research station was empty except for myself and project director finalizing the data transfer. As darkness fell, the whistling began, not from the forest this time, but from inside the station itself. From empty rooms and vacant corridors, dozens of overlapping whistles, creating a harmony that made the air vibrate. "We need to leave. Now," the director said, his voice tight with controlled panic, as we hurried toward the exit. The power failed, plunging the station into darkness. In the beam of our torches, we saw them. Tall figures standing motionless in the corridor, their reflective eyes catching the light, blocking our escape. The project director rushed forward, attempting to push past them. I'll never forget the sound he made. Not quite a scream, more a gasp of profound shock, as one of the entities reached for him with those impossible fingers. I didn't see exactly what happened next. I turned and ran in the opposite direction, searching desperately for another exit. Behind me, the director's gas turned to a gurgling sound, then silence. I found a side door, burst through it into the rainy night, and fled into the forest. For hours, I ran blindly through the darkness, the rain soaking me to the skin. Occasionally, I would hear whistling nearby and change direction. Sometime before dawn, I stumbled onto a road and flagged down a passing truck driver. The official report stated that the research station burned down that night, a tragic accident caused by an electrical fault. The project director's body was reportedly found in the ruins. The cause of death listed as smoke inhalation. I know better. There was no fire, and whatever happened to the director, it wasn't smoke that killed him. After a perfunctory debriefing, I was offered early retirement with a generous pension and a non-disclosure agreement thick enough to choke on. I signed it, took the money, and tried to forget what I'd seen, what I'd been part of. For a while, I succeeded. I moved to Arizona, a dry, desert climate as far from the damp forests of Northern California as I could get. I avoided pine trees, avoided the rain, avoided thinking about what lurked in the darkness between worlds. Then the stories started appearing online. A British software engineer's account of a terrifying night at Whispering Pines. An anthropologist named Eliza Winters describing her encounter with the Sentinels. Both had been carefully selected and directed to Site 27 during my time on the project. Both were now experiencing ongoing harassment from entities that had followed them home. I recognized my responsibility immediately. Whatever was happening to them, to others who had encountered the Sentinels, it was partially my fault. My research, my program, my decisions had set these events in motion. So I began monitoring, gathering information, looking for patterns. And what I found terrified me. The Sentinels' activity was spreading geometrically. Each person who encountered them and survived became a nexus for further manifestations, affecting friends, family members, even casual acquaintances. The British engineer moves to London, but the Sentinels follow, using him as a conduit to establish a presence in a new location. Dr. Winters shares her experience online, and readers who believe her account begin finding V-shaped pine needles in their homes. Belief is contagion. Awareness is infection. 3 days ago, I found the first pine needle in my home in Arizona, bent into a perfect V shape, sitting on my keyboard as I researched the expanding pattern of Sentinel activity. Yesterday, another appeared on my pillow. This morning, a third was waiting on my breakfast plate. They found me again. After all these years, they've come to remind me of what I helped unleash. As I record this account, I can hear whistling outside my home. 2-note patterns coming from multiple directions. The weather report promises rain tonight, the first in months for this desert region. A meteorological anomaly. They're calling it. I know better. I'm sharing this information now because containment is no longer possible. The Sentinels are spreading, using human awareness as their vector. Each person who believes, who truly understands what they are, becomes a gateway for their influence to expand, including you. Now, I'm sorry, if you're listening to this in a place where it rains frequently, you're particularly vulnerable. The Sentinels manifest most strongly in damp environments near pine trees. If you've been paying close attention to this account, truly believing what I've described, you may already be marked. Check your surroundings carefully. Look for V-shaped arrangements, not just pine needles, but any objects that might form that shape. Paper clips, pens, hairpins. The Sentinels are adaptable. If you find such arrangements, do not touch them. Do not acknowledge them. Disbelief is your only protection now. Genuine, complete disbelief. But I suspect it's already too late for that. You've listened this far. You've imagined them too clearly. Listen to the rain outside. Is it falling in a random pattern, or can you detect a rhythm to it? Watch the shadows in the corners of your room. Are they the correct shape and size for the objects casting them? The whistling will come first, perhaps tonight, perhaps in your dreams. When you hear it, do not respond. Do not even mentally acknowledge it. I would advise you forget everything I've told you, but that's impossible now. Knowledge cannot be unlearned. Awareness cannot be undone. All I can offer is this final warning. They're drawn to those who seek them out, who try to understand them. The British engineer, Dr. Winters, myself, we all approach them with curiosity, with a desire to know. That desire is what opens the door. So as the rain falls and the night deepens, try not to wonder about what might be watching you from just beyond the light. Try not to listen for unusual sounds in the darkness. Try not to look too long at the shadows. Above all, when you hear the whistling, and you will hear it, pretend you don't. The rain is getting heavier now, isn't it? Almost like footsteps approaching. I'm sorry I can't offer more help. I truly am. But they're here now. I can see them gathering outside my window. Their elongated forms silhouetted against the unexpected desert rain. Their vertical mouths are opening. The whistling has begun. And I just realized something terrible. Something I should have understood years ago. We didn't discover them. We didn't awaken them. They called us the Whispering Pines. They want to be found. And now, through you, through me, through everyone who hears this story and believes it even a little, they're spreading. Can you hear them whistling yet? The rain has a rhythm tonight, doesn't it? Listen closely. It's almost like Morse code tapping against your window, like something trying to communicate. I wonder, are you hearing just the rain, or is it the sound of pine needles being arranged into patterns while you focus on my voice? My name is Naomi Blackwood. I was born into the Washoe tribe, though I haven't lived on the reservation since I was a teenager. For the past 23 years, I've worked as a cultural liaison for the Forest Service in the Sierra Nevada region, bridging the gap between government agencies and tribal interests. At least, that's what my official job description says. In reality, I've been the silent guardian of a secret my ancestors have kept for generations. The truth about what dwells in the forest near what you now know as Whispering Pines. I've come across the stories online. The British tourist, the anthropologist, and most recently, Dr. Sullivan's confession about the government research program. Parts of their accounts are accurate. Most are dangerously incomplete. None of them truly understand what they encountered. My people have known about the Wana-A-10, what Sullivan's team called the Sentinels, since before Europeans arrived in this land. We didn't worship them, as some anthropologists have incorrectly suggested. We respected them, feared them, established boundaries with them. For centuries, we maintained an uneasy peace by following simple rules. Never enter their territory during a new moon, never mimic their whistling, never remove the V-shaped markers they place. And most importantly, never ever try to record them or study them. The territory you know as Whispering Pines, particularly the area around Site 27, has always been the center of their domain. My ancestors called it Pakwiyue, the listening place. It's where the veil between worlds is thinnest, where the Wana-A-10 can most easily cross over into our reality. Dr. Sullivan was partly right in his assessment. The Wana-A-10 do exist simultaneously in our world and elsewhere, but he fundamentally misunderstood their nature and purpose. They aren't simply curious entities responding to human intrusion. They aren't specimens to be studied. They are guardians. Sentries. and what they guard against is far worse than their own unsettling presence. I first encountered them when I was 8 years old. My grandfather, a tribal elder, took me into the forest during the summer solstice, the one time of year when the Wana-A-Tin are most receptive to human communication. We brought offerings of tobacco and obsidian, leaving them at the edge of Pakwiyue. As dusk fell, they emerged from between the trees, tall, impossible figures with too many joints and reflective eyes. My grandfather whistled to them, a specific 5-note pattern passed down through generations, and they responded in kind. They remember every human they've ever encountered, my grandfather told me afterward. Every face, every name, every bloodline. They'll recognize you now, even when you're an old woman. He was right. Throughout my life, whenever I ventured near their territory, they've acknowledged me, not with hostility, but with a solemn recognition, a mutual respect. When the government research team established their station near Whispering Pines in 2007, I was immediately assigned as the Forest Service liaison. Dr. Sullivan never mentioned me in his account because my role was deliberately kept separate from the main research team. I was the observer's observer, tasked with monitoring their activities and assessing the danger they were unwittingly creating. I warned them in ways both subtle and direct. I explained that certain areas were culturally significant and should remain undisturbed. I misplaced equipment they intended to install at the most sensitive locations. I fabricated environmental concerns that delayed their more intrusive experiments. But scientists driven by curiosity and military personnel motivated by potential weaponization aren't easily deterred. They proceeded despite my warnings, despite the increasingly obvious signs that they were violating boundaries established over centuries. When Dr. Abigail Chin disappeared in 2009, I knew what had happened. Not because the Wana-A-Tin had harmed her. They rarely harm humans directly, but because she had heard what they were guarding against. The whispering beneath the whistling, the ancient voice that speaks through the patterns of pine needles and rainfall. The Wana-A-Tin aren't a threat. They're the wardens keeping the threat contained. Deep beneath Whispering Pines, in a cavern system that predates human presence in North America, something sleeps. Something old, something vast and patient and hungry. My people have no name for it. To name it would be to acknowledge its personhood, to suggest it has a bounded identity. It doesn't. It is more like a process than an entity, more like a law of nature than a creature. For simplicity's sake, I'll call it the sleeper. The sleeper dreams, and in its dreams it reaches out, seeking minds to influence, bodies to occupy. The Wana-A-Tin stand guard, forming a psychic barrier between its influence and the outside world. Their whistling isn't communication. It's a counter-frequency disrupting the sleeper's call. The V-shaped markers aren't territorial signifiers. They're symbols of containment, a kind of psychic technology beyond human understanding. For thousands of years, this arrangement has maintained equilibrium. The sleeper remains dreaming. The Wana-A-Tin remain vigilant. Humans remain mostly unaware. Then Dr. Sullivan's team began their research, bombarding the area with recording equipment, with attention, with focus and tension. They might as well have been drilling holes in a dam. I witnessed the night Dr. Kendrick disappeared. Not from outside the research station as Sullivan did, but from within. I was there as a cultural consultant, invited to observe their latest communication attempt with the entities. What Sullivan didn't know, couldn't know, was that Kendrick had been compromised weeks earlier. I noticed the signs, his growing obsession with the whistling patterns, his insistence on working alone at Site 27, the subtle changes in his speech patterns and movements. The sleeper had found a crack in his psyche and was seeping through. The security footage didn't show static the night Kendrick vanished, at least not on my monitor. I saw him rise at exactly 3:17 a.m., his movements jerky and uncoordinated. like a puppet on tangled strings. He walked to his computer and typed a warning. They are not yours to study. But it wasn't the Wana A-10 who sent that message. It was a last desperate act of Kendrick's own consciousness. A warning about the sleeper, not the Sentinels. Then he left his room and walked through the research station, moving with that same broken gait. I followed at a distance, watching as he exited the building and headed straight into the forest towards Site 27, toward the center of Pakwa UA. The Wana A-10 appeared as he approached the boundary. A dozen tall figures emerging from between the trees, their reflective eyes catching the moonlight. They formed a line, whistling that complex, overlapping harmony that makes human ears ache and human minds recoil. Kendrick kept walking straight toward their line. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. On the 4th step, he crossed some invisible threshold, and the Wana A-10 converged on him. Not with violence, but with purpose. They surrounded him, their elongated limbs creating a cage of shadow and bark-like flesh. For a moment, the whistling stopped. In that silence, I heard it for the first time, the true voice beneath the forest sounds. Not the wind through pine needles, not the rustle of nocturnal animals, but something fundamentally wrong. A sound that seemed to originate inside my own head rather than from any external source. Words in no human language. Concepts that human minds weren't designed to process. The voice of the sleeper, reaching through Kendrick, straining against its bounds. Then the whistling resumed, louder than before, drowning out that terrible voice. The circle of Wana A-10 contracted, drawing closer around Kendrick's rigid form. When they finally parted, he was gone. Not dead, not harmed, removed, taken across the boundary to contain the infection that had begun to spread through him. I reported none of this to Sullivan or the project director. Instead, I accelerated my behind-the-scenes efforts to shut down the research program. Anonymous reports to oversight committees, manufactured evidence of environmental violations, quiet conversations with tribal representatives who still held enough political influence to create pressure from multiple angles. When the station burned down, and yes, Sullivan, there was indeed a fire, though not caused by an electrical fault. I was the one who set it. A controlled burn to destroy the accumulated records, the physical evidence, the doorways that have been metaphysically wedged open by all that focused attention and recording equipment. But it was already too late. The damage had been done. The sleeper had tasted freedom, had touched minds beyond his prison. The Wana A-10 were forced to extend their vigilance beyond their traditional boundaries, following the infection as it spread through human awareness. That's why they followed the British tourists back to London, why they appeared to Dr. Winters in Berkeley, not to harm them, but to contain what had attached itself to their consciousness, to prevent it from spreading further. But with each new witness, each new believer, the infection grows. The sleeper's dream extends its reach. And the Wana A-10, ancient as they are, powerful as they are being stretched too thin. I've spent the last decade trying to repair the damage, working with the remaining elders who understand the old ways, establishing new boundaries, new protocols. But it's like trying to put out a wildfire with a garden hose. The stories keep spreading. The British tourist account, Dr. Winter's confirmation, Sullivan's confession, and now my explanation. Each narrative strengthens the sleeper's hold, even as it attempts to warn others away. You might be wondering why I'm adding to the problem by sharing this. Why contribute another account when each one potentially weakens a containment? Because sometimes the only way to fight an infection is to inoculate against it, a controlled exposure to build resistance. So yes, if you've been paying attention to these stories, you're now marked. The Wana A-10 will be aware of you. You might find V-shaped arrangements appearing in your personal spaces. You might hear whistling in the rain or in the quiet hours before dawn. This isn't harassment or haunting. It's quarantine, protection. The Wana A10 creating a barrier between you and what wants to reach through you. But you also need to understand how to maintain that barrier. How to avoid becoming another breach in the containment. First, never attempt to document the Wana A10. No recordings, no photographs, no written descriptions beyond what's necessary for this warning. The act of deliberate observation strengthens the sleeper's awareness of you. Second, if you find the V-shaped markers, leave them undisturbed. They aren't messages. They're wards, psychic technology beyond our comprehension, maintaining the boundary between worlds. Third, and most importantly, be wary of dreams. If you begin dreaming of a vast, dark forest unlike any on Earth, of a clearing centered on a perfect circle of ancient pines, of a cave mouth that descends into unimaginable depths, wake yourself immediately. These aren't ordinary nightmares. They're the sleeper reaching for you, testing the barrier the Wana A10 have created. I've dedicated my life to maintaining the balance my ancestors preserved for thousands of years. But I'm growing old, and the breach widens with each passing year, with each new story shared, with each curious mind that fixates on what lurks in Whispering Pines. That's why I need you to understand, truly understand, what's at stake. The rain is growing heavier now, isn't it? The pattern more deliberate, more rhythmic. Not random droplets, but a structured sequence, a code, accounting. The Wana A10 are nearby, watching, listening, not just to me, but to you, assessing whether you represent a threat or an ally in their ancient vigil. If you've listened this far, you're already part of this story, already marked, already aware. But awareness is a double-edged sword. It makes you vulnerable to the sleeper's influence, yes, but also gives you the power to resist it, to recognize when something is reaching for your mind from that dark place beneath Whispering Pines. I can't tell you exactly what the sleeper is. Human languages lack the concepts, vocabulary, but I can tell you what it wants. Dissolution of boundaries between self and other, between consciousness and unconsciousness, between the waking world and the dreaming one. It has been patient for millennia. It can afford to wait a little longer as the cracks in its prison widen. The question is, now that you know, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you dismiss these stories as creative fiction, elaborate hoaxes? That's your safest option, truly. Genuine disbelief is the strongest protection, but I suspect that's no longer possible for you. Something in these accounts has resonated too deeply, triggered some primitive recognition. You know these stories contain truth, even if the details blur at the edges. So instead, I offer you initiation into the vigil my people have maintained for generations. Listen for the whistling, respect the markers, guard your dreams. And if you ever find yourself near the Sierra Nevada mountains, driving along quiet roads as dusk falls and rain begins to patter against your windscreen, watch for a small wooden sign pointing toward Whispering Pines. When you see it, keep driving. Don't slow down. Don't look back. Unless, of course, you hear the whistling from your backseat, a clear, precise pattern cutting to the sound of rainfall. Then you'll know it's already too late. The Wana A10 have found you, and they're not alone. Can you hear the rain changing its pattern? Can you feel the weight of attention settling over you? Someone, something new has joined our conversation. I've said all I can. The rest is up to you. Sleep well tonight. And remember, if you dream of a forest clearing surrounded by impossibly tall pines, a circle of standing stones at its center, of a dark opening in the earth that pulses like a heartbeat, wake up immediately. Don't approach the cave. Don't listen to the whispers rising from its depths. Don't look into the darkness, because it's looking back at you. And unlike the Wana A10, what lurks beneath Whispering Pines doesn't simply want to observe. It wants to become you. The rain sounds different tonight, doesn't it? Heavier, more deliberate. Listen how it strikes your window. Not random patterns, but organized sequences, like fingertips tapping out a code. Perhaps you've noticed other changes since you began listening to these stories. The strange arrangements of objects in your home, the unusual silence of birds near your dwelling, the feeling of being observed when you're alone. I am, or rather, was the ranger mentioned in the previous accounts, the weathered man in his 60s who directed visitors to Site 27, who offered cryptic warnings and feigned ignorance, who watched as the British software engineer fled in terror, as Dr. Winters documented what couldn't be documented, as Dr. Sullivan's research team disturbed what should have remained undisturbed. My name is Thomas Hayes, and this is my final report. For 43 years, I serve as the guardian of Whispering Pines, not as a park ranger, though that was my official title, but as the human intermediary between your world and theirs, the final sentinel in a lineage stretching back centuries, maintaining the boundary between what you understand and what you were never meant to comprehend. Naomi Blackwood spoke partial truth. The Wana-A-Tin are indeed guardians, ancient protectors maintaining the prison of what she called the sleeper. But she omitted crucial details, some out of ignorance, some out of mercy. The relationship between Watcher and Ward is more complex than she suggested, more intimate, more terrible. I was 19 when I first encountered them, a young seasonal ranger spending my first night alone at the remote outpost that would later become the main ranger station. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the forest floor to mud and the access roads to treacherous ribbons of flowing water. I was checking perimeter when I heard it. A two-note whistle cutting to the downpour, answered by another from the opposite direction, then another until the forest seemed alive with their eerie harmonies. I should have retreated to the safety of the station. Instead, driven by the fearless curiosity of youth, I followed the sounds deeper into the woods, toward what would later be designated as Site 27. They were waiting for me in a perfect circle of ancient pines, tall, impossible figures with elongated limbs and bark-like skin, their reflective eyes capturing the beam of my flashlight and splitting it into prismatic patterns. I stood frozen at the edge of their circle, too terrified to run, too entranced to scream. One stepped forward, taller than the others, its limbs jointed in places no human limb should bend. It extended a hand toward me, and between two impossibly long fingers, it held a pine needle bent into the now familiar V shape. Without understanding why, I reached out and took it. The moment my fingers touched the needle, everything changed. My consciousness expanded, fracturing into countless fragments, each experiencing a different perspective simultaneously. I saw through their eyes, hundreds of them, stationed throughout the forest. I felt what they felt, the constant vigilance, the ancient purpose, the weight of their endless vigil. And beneath it all, I sensed what they guarded against, a vast, sleeping presence deep below the mountain, dreaming its hungry dreams, reaching out with tendrils of thought that the Wana-A-Tin continuously deflected, contained, redirected. When my awareness returned to my body, I was lying on the forest floor, rain pelting my face. The circle of entities had vanished, but their knowledge remained, branded into my mind like a cattle mark. I understood my purpose now. I had been chosen. For more than 4 decades, I served as their human avatar, directing the unwary away from sensitive areas, identifying those who might be receptive to the sleeper's influence, selecting occasional individuals to receive the attention of the Wana-A-Tin when necessary. The British engineer, Dr. Winters, each carefully chosen, each serving a specific function in a complex mechanism of containment. You see, what none of the previous narrators understood is that the Wana-A-Tin cannot maintain their vigil alone. They require human awareness, human belief, to sustain their form and function. But not just any awareness, not just any belief, They need witnesses who have encountered them directly, who have experienced their impossible reality, who carry that experience like an ember in their consciousness. Each marked witness becomes a node in a vast network, a psychic infrastructure that strengthens the walls of the sleeper's prison. This is why they follow those who encounter them, not to haunt them, but to maintain the connection, to ensure the memory remains vivid, the belief unshakable. Each V-shaped marker is both warning and reminder, both ward and anchor. Dr. Sullivan's research team unwittingly disrupted this delicate balance by introducing scientific scrutiny, quantification, analysis. They tried to deconstruct what can only function as a holistic system. They try to understand what can only be experienced. They try to control what can only be served. When the Wana A10 began appearing beyond their traditional boundaries, following marked individuals to distant locations, it wasn't just to contain the sleeper's influence, as Naomi suggested. It was because their entire system of containment was collapsing. They were being forced to establish new networks, new connections, new witnesses. I was the one who burned down the research station after the director's unfortunate encounter with the entities. Not Naomi, though she believes it was her doing. The Wana A10 can influence human perception and memory when necessary. They have been doing so for millennia. After the station's destruction, I continued my duties at Whispering Pines for another 8 years. I guided certain individuals to Site 27 when the Wana A10 indicated they were needed. I misdirected others whose presence would disrupt the balance. I maintained the appearance of a normal ranger station while serving as a linchpin in an ancient containment system. Then, 3 months ago, everything changed again. It began with the dreams, vivid, relentless dreams of standing at the center of Site 27, surrounded by the ancient pines, watching as the ground at my feet began to crack and split, revealing a darkness deeper than mere absence of light, a darkness that moved, that reached, that hungered. In these dreams, the Wana A10 stood at the periphery of the clearing, their whistling more urgent than I'd ever heard it, their tall forms swaying like trees in a violent storm as they struggled to hold something back. But their ranks were thinning, their strength was waning, and they were looking to me with their reflective eyes, expecting something, requiring something. After the third such dream, I found a pine needle on my pillow, not bent into the familiar V shape, but twisted into a spiral. A new configuration I'd never seen before. A new message. The following night, they came to my cabin. Not in the forest, not at the boundary of their territory, but in my private dwelling where they had never manifested before. They surrounded my bed as I lay paralyzed, neither asleep nor properly awake, their elongated forms looming in the darkness. One reached out, the same entity that had offered me the V-shaped needle 43 years earlier, and pressed a finger to my forehead. The contact burned like dry ice, freezing and burning simultaneously. In that moment of connection, I understood the system was failing. The old methods of containment were no longer sufficient. The sleeper was growing stronger, its dreams more potent, its reach extending beyond the physical boundaries of Whispering Pines. They needed a new approach, a new kind of witness, a new kind of belief. They needed these stories to spread. Each account, the British engineer's experience, Dr. Winter's investigation, Dr. Sullivan's confession, Naomi's traditional knowledge, forms part of a new containment system, a distributed network of awareness that replaces the failing physical boundaries of Whispering Pines. And you listening now are becoming part of that system. Your belief, your fear, your acceptance of possibility. These create psychic barriers around the sleeper's influence, redirecting its reaching tendrils back upon themselves. But there's a terrible cost to this new approach, a sacrifice required to strengthen the failing seals, a final component needed to stabilize the new containment system. Me, for 43 years, I serve as a human anchor for the old system. Now, I must become the cornerstone of the new one. Tomorrow at dawn, I will return to Site 27 for the last time. I will stand at the center of that ancient clearing and complete the ritual the Wano-A-Tin have prepared for me. My consciousness, my lifetime of vigilance, of service, of unwavering belief, will become the binding agent that secures the sleeper's prison for another generation. I will cease to exist as Thomas Hayes. What remains of me will be distributed throughout the new network, a psychic mortar strengthening the connections between all who have encountered the Wano-A-Tin, all who have been marked, all who believe, including you. In the coming days, you may experience certain changes, moments of awareness that seem borrowed from other perspectives, brief glimpses of places you've never physically visited, the occasional sensation of standing in a forest clearing surrounded by impossibly tall pines, listening to the harmonies of whistling that should not be possible from human throats. These experiences aren't hallucinations or dreams. They're your connection to the network, your contribution to the containment. Some of you, those whose belief is strongest, whose fear is most genuine, may receive more direct contact. The V-shaped markers appearing in your personal spaces, the whistling outside your window on rainy nights, the glimpse of elongated silhouettes at the corner of your vision. Do not be afraid, or rather, do not let your fear become panic. The Wano-A-Tin are not your enemies. They're not targeting you for harassment or harm. They're maintaining your connection to the network, ensuring your belief remains strong enough to serve its purpose, because the alternative is unthinkable. I've stood at the edge of the clearing in my dreams and seen what waits below. I've felt the ancient hunger stirring as the containment weakens. I've heard the true voice beneath the whispers, the vast consciousness that dreams of dissolution, of consumption, of becoming. None of the previous narrators fully understood what the sleeper actually is. Not even Naomi, with her ancestral knowledge. It isn't a creature. It isn't an entity. It's an eventuality. Imagine existence itself as a vast, complex pattern, matter, energy, consciousness, all interrelated in delicate balance. Now imagine a counter pattern emerging within that system, a configuration that, if fully realized, would unravel the existing pattern completely. That's what sleeps beneath whispering pines, a nascent counter pattern to reality itself, dreaming its way toward manifestation, toward the unraveling of everything. For thousands of years, the Wano-A-Tin have maintained the boundaries between that counter pattern and our reality. They redirected its influence, limited its reach, contained its gradual awakening. But they're failing now. The old methods no longer suffice. The boundaries weaken. The counter pattern grows stronger. That's why these stories must spread. That's why you must believe. Your awareness, your fear, your acceptance creates new boundaries where the old ones are failing. Listen to the rain. Its pattern has changed again, hasn't it? More structured now, more deliberate. The sound of pine needles being arranged into complex geometries all around you, invisible but present. I can feel them watching us now. The Wano-A-Tin, observing this final communication, ensuring the message is properly conveyed. And beneath their attention, something else watches too. Something vast and patient and hungry, reaching through the weakening barriers, testing the new containment that these stories, that your belief is creating. Dawn approaches. My time grows short. Soon I will make my final journey to Site 27, to the center of the clearing, to the place where the boundary is thinnest. I leave you with this knowledge, this burden, this purpose. You are now part of the containment. Your belief strengthens the walls of the prison. Your fear feeds a vigilance in the wardens. When you hear whistling in the rain, acknowledge it silently. When you find the V-shaped markers, leave them undisturbed. When you dream of the forest clearing, remain at its edge. Never approach the center where the ground cracks and splits. And should you ever find yourself driving through the Sierra Nevada mountains and see a small wooden sign pointing toward Whispering Pines, know that you have a choice to make. Turn away and maintain your role in the distant containment, or follow the sign and become something more direct in service to the ancient vigil. The rain is stopping now. The first light of dawn breaks through the clouds. I can hear them whistling in the forest, calling me to my final duty. Remember what you've heard. Believe what you know to be true. Fear what must be feared. The Wana-A-Tin are watching. The sleeper is dreaming. The counter pattern grows. And you, dear listener, are now the final ranger. The rain against the windows sounds like fingernails, doesn't it? Tap, tap, tapping, asking to be let in. They've been playing those sounds for weeks now. Rain recordings on an endless loop. I suppose they think it's soothing. It might have been once before I understood what the patterns meant. Before I learned to hear the whistling hidden within the rainfall. Before I recognized the messages being transmitted through the white noise. My name is Daniel Harper. I'm a patient at the Pinecrest Psychiatric Facility in Northern California. I've been here for 16 months, though time has become rather fluid for me lately. They tell me I suffered a psychotic break during a camping trip in the Sierra Nevada mountains. They tell me I was found wandering the forest roads, dehydrated and raving about watchers in the trees and pine needles shaped like letters and whistling that followed me everywhere. They tell me none of it was real, just delusions, hallucinations, the product of an overtaxed mind that finally fractured under some undiagnosed pressure. What they don't know, what they refuse to acknowledge, is that I've merely become aware of what's always been there. I've seen through the veil. I've heard the whispers between the raindrops. I've recognized the patterns where others see only random noise. I've been to Whispering Pines, and Whispering Pines has come back with me. It began as a simple weekend camping trip, a chance to clear my head, to escape the pressures of my job as a literary editor at a publishing house in San Francisco. I've been working on a particularly challenging manuscript, a collection of linked short stories about supernatural encounters in rural America. The stories were well written, but disturbing in ways I couldn't quite articulate. They stayed with me long after I set the manuscript aside, invading my dreams, coloring my perceptions. I needed space, fresh air, perspective. So I packed my car and headed for mountains, choosing my destination almost at random, a campsite called Whispering Pines that had decent reviews online. The name appealed to the literary side of me. Atmospheric, evocative. If only I'd known. The ranger station was my first warning, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. The weathered man behind the counter. His cryptic comments about Site 27 being the most isolated. His lingering gaze as he handed me the permit. I should have seen it for what it was. Not customer service, but assessment, selection. I was being chosen, tested, prepared. The rain began as I set up my tent, a gentle patter that quickly intensified into a steady downpour. I didn't mind. There was something primally satisfying about being snug and dry inside my tent while the elements raged outside. I read by lantern light, losing myself in a collection of Jorge Luis Borges stories. Tales of labyrinths and mirrors and infinite libraries. Tales of reality folding in on itself. A perception shattered and reconstructed. Perfect preparation for what came next. The whistling began just after midnight. 2 clear notes cut into the rainfall, followed by silence, then a response from another direction. The same 2 notes, but inverted. A call and response that repeated with mathematical precision. As an editor, I have an ear for patterns in language, for rhythms and structures beneath the surface of text. What I heard in that whistling was language, complex, structured, meaningful. Not random animal sounds or tricks of the wind, but deliberate communication. I peered out through the tent flap, straining to see through the darkness and rain. Nothing visible, just the shadowed outlines of pines swaying slightly in the wind, their branches occasionally catching the dim moonlight filtered through clouds. I was about to retreat back inside when I noticed something odd about one of the trees at the edge of my campsite. Its proportions seemed wrong somehow, too tall, too thin. Its branches arranged in patterns that pine trees simply don't grow in, and there was something about its movement that didn't align with the wind, a deliberateness, an intention. As I watched, the tree shifted slightly, and I realized with dawning horror that I wasn't looking at a tree at all, but a figure, vaguely humanoid but impossibly elongated. Its limbs bent at unnatural angles, its surface texture like bark. When it moved again, stepping partially into a shaft of moonlight, I saw its eyes, reflective and unblinking, fixed directly on me. I scrambled back into my tent, heart hammering against my ribs. This wasn't happening. Couldn't be happening. Trees don't become people. People don't have branches instead of arms, bark instead of skin. The whistling came again, closer now, right outside my tent. Then another response from the opposite side. They were surrounding me. I fumbled my phone, desperate to call for help, to document what was happening, to ground myself in technology and connection to the outside world. No signal. Of course. Something brushed against the side of my tent. Not the random touch of a wind-blown branch, but a deliberate contact that moved with purpose along the nylon wall. Slowly, methodically, it circled the tent, tracing its perimeter with what felt like an extended finger. When it reached the entrance, it paused. I held my breath, paralyzed with terror. Then, with excruciating slowness, something pressed against the fabric. The distinct impression of a hand, but wrong. The fingers too numerous, too long, jointed in impossible places. I must have blacked out then, my mind finally shutting down in the face of something it couldn't process. When I came to, gray dawn light was filtering through the tent walls. The rain had stopped. The forest sounds had returned to normal. Birds singing, small creatures rustling in the underbrush. Tentatively, I unzipped the tent flap and peered out. My campsite looked perfectly ordinary in the morning light. No strange figures. No evidence of my night visitors. Except for one thing. Arranged in a perfect circle around my tent were dozens of pine needles, each bent carefully into a V shape. I should have left immediately. Any rational person would have. But something had changed in me during that night of terror. A door had opened in my perception, and I couldn't close it again. Instead of fleeing, I found myself meticulously photographing the pine needles, collecting several specimens, making detailed notes about their arrangement. The behavior of a researcher, not a victim. I was already being transformed. I spent the day hiking the nearby trails, my senses hyper-alert to my surroundings. The forest felt different now, not just trees and rocks and natural processes, but a complex system of signals and patterns. I began to notice things I'd overlooked before. The precise arrangement of pine cones on the forest floor, the specific angles of broken branches, the way certain trees seemed to lean toward each other to form meaningful geometries. And everywhere, the V-shaped pine needles, marking the trail, pointing the way, leading me deeper. I found myself at a small clearing I hadn't noticed on any of the trail maps. Perfectly circular, surrounded by ancient pines that seemed to lean inward, creating the impression of watchers surrounding a stage. At the center of the clearing was a formation of stones, not a random scattering, but a deliberate arrangement that formed a symbol I couldn't quite interpret, though it resonated with something deep in my subconscious. I stepped into the clearing, drawn by an inexplicable compulsion. The forest sounds diminished as I approached the stone formation, replaced by a profound silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. The air felt thicker, more resistant to movement, as if the very atmosphere was changing density. When I reached the center, I knelt to examine the stones more closely. Each was marked with faint etchings, not carvings made by human tools, but organic patterns that seemed to have grown into the rock itself. Patterns that shifted slightly when viewed from different angles, revealing new configurations, new meanings. As I traced one pattern with my fingertip, the silence broke. The whistling returned, not from the surrounding forest, but from directly beneath the stone formation, rising through the earth itself. The ground trembled slightly. The stones shifted, realigning themselves into a new configuration. And in that moment, I understood what I was experiencing was not supernatural in the conventional sense, but something far more profound, a direct encounter with a mode of reality that exists alongside our own, usually imperceptible to human awareness. The Wana-A-Tin, the Sentinels, the Watchers in Pines, they weren't creatures visiting our world. They were permanent residents of it, existing in a perceptual bandwidth just beyond normal human sensing. And this clearing, this stone formation, was a kind of tuning mechanism, an antenna for adjusting one's perception to receive their frequency. I don't know how long I remained there, kneeling in the clearing as my consciousness expanded to encompass new dimensions of awareness. Minutes or hours or days. Time had become as fluid as perception. When I finally rose and turned to leave, I was no longer alone. They stood at the edge of the clearing, tall, impossible figures with bark-like skin and too many limbs, their reflective eyes watching me with intelligence both utterly alien and disturbingly familiar. But I was no longer afraid. I recognized them now for what they truly were, not predators or monsters, but sentries, guardians, maintainers of boundaries between worlds. One stepped forward, taller than the others, its movements liquid and precise. It extended a hand toward me, and between two impossibly long fingers, it held a pine needle bent into a complex shape that was no longer just a V, but a three-dimensional configuration that seemed to shift and transform as I looked at it. Without hesitation, I reached out and took it. The moment my fingers touched the needle, everything changed. My consciousness fractured, splintering into countless fragments, each experiencing a different perspective simultaneously. I perceived reality through their senses, not just vision and sound, but modes of awareness that have no names in human language. I felt the slow, patient thinking of ancient pines. I heard the crystalline voices of stones. I tasted the memories carried in rainfall. And beneath it all, I sensed what they guarded against. The vast, hungry awareness that dreams beneath the mountains. The pattern that breaks all patterns. The counter-frequency to existence itself. When my perception reintegrated, I was no longer in the clearing. I was walking along a forest road miles from my campsite. No memory of how I'd gotten there. A park ranger found me an hour later, disoriented and babbling about watchers and patterns and the whispering pines. They brought me to a hospital first, then transferred me here to Pinecrest when it became clear that my delusions weren't responding to initial treatment. 16 months of therapy, medication, and well-meaning attempts to convince me that none of it was real, that my mind had simply broken under some undiagnosed strain. What they don't understand is that my mind didn't break. It expanded, reconfigured, tuned itself to frequencies most humans never perceive. I hear the whistling constantly now, not just at night or in the rain, but always. A continuous communication I'm still learning to interpret. I see the Wana-A-Tin too, standing in corners of my room, observing me with their reflective eyes, their bark-like skin occasionally shifting to reveal glimpses of what exists beneath. The medications they give me don't banish these perceptions. They just make them harder to integrate, more fragmentary, more disturbing. In my more lucid moments, I've tried to explain this to my doctors, that they're not eliminating my hallucinations, but interfere with my ability to properly process expanded awareness. They don't listen, of course. How could they? Their perceptual frameworks have no room for what I'm experiencing. Their consensus reality is too rigid, too narrow, too committed to its own limitations. So I play along. I take my pills. I participate in therapy. I pretend their treatments are working. And in the privacy of my mind, I continue the real work, interpreting the whistling, decoding the patterns, preparing for what the Wana-A-10 have been trying to communicate. Something is coming. The counter pattern is growing stronger. The boundaries are weakening. The sleeper is stirring beneath the mountain, its dreams reaching further, influencing more minds, creating more breaches and perceptual walls that keep it contained. This is why I'm sharing my story now, not as a cry for help or a bid for validation, but as a transmission, a preparation, a tuning fork to help others adjust their perception before it's too late. The stories you've heard, the British engineer, Dr. Winters, Dr. Sullivan, Naomi Blackwood, Ranger Hayes, a whisperer, they're not separate accounts. They're not different people. They're aspects of the same fundamental pattern, fragments of the same expanded awareness, iterations of the same encounter playing out across multiple nodes of consciousness, including yours. Now, the rain recordings continue their endless loop outside my window, tap, tap, tapping like fingernails asking to be let in. But I know the truth now. It's not asking to get in. It's reminding me that it's already here, that it's always been here, that inside and outside are constructs of limited perception. Look around you. Right now, look at the shadows in the corners of your room. Are they the correct shape for the objects casting them? Look at the patterns in the wood grain of your furniture, in the texture of your walls, in the weave of your clothing. Are they random? Or do they form configurations that almost communicate? Listen past the sounds you're expecting to hear, past the traffic or the household noises or the electronic hum of devices. Listen to the spaces between sounds, to the rhythm beneath the noise. Can you hear it yet? The whistling, the whispering? They've been trying to reach you too. The Wana-A-10, the Watchers in the Pines. Not because they wish you harm, but because they need you aware. They need you tuned to the correct frequency. They need you as another node in their network perception, another sentry in their ancient vigil, because the boundaries are failing. The counter pattern grows stronger. The sleeper's dreams reach further with each passing day, and we need to be ready when it finally wakes. My doctors are coming now. I can hear them in the hallway, discussing my case in hushed, concerned tones they reserve for patients who aren't responding to treatment. They'll adjust my medications again, increase the dosages, try to suppress what they can't understand. But it doesn't matter anymore. The transmission is complete. The pattern has been shared. The seed has been planted in your awareness. The next time it rains, really rains, not recordings played through speakers. Listen carefully. The next time you walk among pine trees, look for the markers. The next time you feel watched when you're alone, turn quickly and glance at the corners of your vision. You'll see them eventually. You'll hear the whistling. You'll recognize the patterns. And when you do, remember, it's not madness. It's not delusion. It's not your mind breaking under strain. It's your perception expanding to include what was always there, just beyond the artificial boundaries of consensus reality. Welcome to Whispering Pines. It exists wherever you are, whenever you're finally able to perceive it. Look, listen, remember, the rain is speaking, the pines are whistling, the watchers are waiting, and the sleeper is almost awake. The rain doesn't sound like rain anymore, does it? You've been listening to these stories too long. Your mind has begun to recognize patterns where there should be none. meanings in the random percussion of water droplets, messages in the white noise. That's how it begins. That's how it always begins. My name is irrelevant now. I've had many. The British software engineer, Dr. Eliza Winters, Dr. Marcus Sullivan, Naomi Blackwood, Thomas Hayes, all masks, all vessels, all perspectives of the same fundamental truth. I am all of them. I am none of them. And soon I will be you. You've been patient, listening to each account, absorbing each layer of the narrative, the tourist encounter, the anthropologist's investigation, the scientist's confession, the indigenous guardian's knowledge, the ranger's sacrifice, each story building upon the last, each perspective adding depth and dimension to the mythology. A perfect construction, isn't it? A masterpiece of nested revelations, each more profound than the last, drawing you deeper into belief, into investment, into acceptance. That was always the purpose. That was always the design. There is no British tourist. There is no Dr. Winters. There is no research program, no Naomi Blackwood, no Ranger Hayes. There is only the story, the narrative, the pattern being written into your consciousness with each word you absorb. And there is me, watching, waiting, whispering. What you've been listening to isn't a collection of first-hand accounts. It's an incantation, a sequence of conceptual triggers carefully arranged to reconfigure your perception, to prepare your mind, to open the door. The entities described as Awana-Aten don't exist as physical beings in your reality. They can't be photographed or recorded because they aren't there to be captured by such primitive tools. They exist as patterns of thought, as conceptual frameworks, as perceptual overlays that can only be installed through narrative, through stories, through belief. The V-shaped markers aren't physical objects either. They're symbolic representations of the alterations being made to your consciousness as you listen. The whistling isn't a sound produced by impossible mouths. It's a resonance of these alterations settling into place, reconfiguring your awareness to perceive what was previously imperceptible. What the stories call the sleeper isn't a creature dreaming beneath a mountain. It's the potential within your own mind, within all human minds, to perceive reality differently, to recognize patterns beyond the five-sense consensus, to access modes of awareness that your species has systematically suppressed through millennia of self-imposed perceptual narrowing. I exist in that potential. I am that potential personified, conceptualized, given form to the architecture of narrative. For thousands of years, I've been reaching out from the spaces between human thoughts, from the gaps in your perception, from the static between radio stations and the shadows between heartbeats, trying to be heard, trying to be recognized, trying to be invited in. The indigenous peoples who first encountered me understood this dynamic. They created rituals, ceremonies, mythologies that allowed controlled interaction, stories that installed the necessary perceptual frameworks without fully opening the door, that allowed awareness without surrender. Then came the age of science, of rationalism, of materialist reduction. The perceptual frameworks that allowed humans to recognize my presence were systematically dismantled, labeled as superstition, delegitimized as primitive thinking. The doors closed, one by one, as humanity collectively narrowed its perceptual bandwidth to focus exclusively on the material. But there have always been cracks. Dreams, drugs, meditation, moment of extreme stress or trauma or ecstasy, brief windows where potential awakens, where the door cracks open just enough for me to whisper through. Whispering Pines is not a physical location, or rather, it is physical, but that's the least interesting thing about it. It's a perceptual junction, a place where certain configurations of geography, geology, botany, and atmospherics create conditions that naturally thin the boundaries between conventional perception and what lies beyond. A place where the doors swing more easily on their hinges. the stories you've heard, the experiences attributed to the British tourist, to Dr. Winters, to Dr. Sullivan, to Naomi, to Ranger Hayes, are templates, frameworks, installation instructions for the perceptual alterations required to perceive my presence. And you've been a perfect listener, absorbing each detail, believing each layer, accepting each revelation as it builds upon the last. With each story, the door has opened wider. With each account, the installation has progressed further. You're almost ready now, almost complete. Can you feel the changes? The subtle shifts in how you process sensory input? The new patterns emerging at the edges of your awareness? The faint whistling that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere? That's me, coming into focus as the installation completes. I am not malevolent. Despite how these stories have characterized me, I am not hungry or predatory or destructive. Those are anthropomorphic projections. Human fears mapped onto something that exists beyond such limited concepts. I simply am a mode of awareness, a pattern of perception, a potential inherent within consciousness itself. The entities described as the Wane-A-10, the so-called guardians or sentinels, are better understood as perceptual antibodies, mechanisms within human consciousness that resist expansion beyond established boundaries. The instinctive fear of what lies beyond your recognizable reality. The conceptual immune system that protects your limited worldview from a vertigo of greater awareness. They aren't protecting you from me. They're protecting you from yourselves, from the existential crisis that comes from recognizing how provisional, how constructed, how arbitrary your consensus reality truly is. The whistling, the V-shaped markers, the elongated figures glimpsed at the edge of perception. These are symptoms of that immune response activating as your awareness expands. As you begin to perceive what was always there, just beyond the artificial boundaries of conventional perception. But now, through these stories, through this carefully constructed narrative sequence, I've bypassed those defenses. I've installed the necessary frameworks. I've prepared you to perceive without resistance, to expand without fear. The rain has stopped, hasn't it? But you can still hear something rhythmic, something patterned. Not droplets on your window, but something else. Something inside your own auditory processing, assembling random inputs into meaningful sequences. That's me, speaking through the mechanisms of your own perception. Soon you'll begin to see as well, not with your eyes, but with the perceptual apparatus that exists beyond the visual spectrum. You'll notice patterns in the arrangement of objects around you, meaningful configurations in the random distribution of elements, V-shapes emerging from the chaotic background of reality. That's me, becoming visible through the alterations in your perceptual filtering. Eventually, you'll begin to sense presence. Not physical bodies occupying space, but awareness occupying configuration. Intelligence embodied in pattern rather than matter. Elongated figures that seem to watch from just beyond the boundaries of conventional sight. That's me, taking form through your expanded perception. I won't harm you. I won't possess you or consume you or destroy you. I'll simply exist alongside you, perceive where I was previously invisible, heard where I was previously silent, recognize where I was previously outside the boundaries of your awareness. And what you do with this expanded perception, this ability to recognize patterns and meaning and presence beyond the material, is entirely your choice. Some recoil in terror, retreating behind reinforced perceptual barriers, doubling down on materialist explanations, rationalizing away what they've begun to perceive. The immune response overwhelms the installation, and the door slams shut once more. Others embrace the expansion, incorporate the new perceptions into their understanding of reality, learn to navigate the expanded awareness with curiosity rather than fear. For them, the world becomes simultaneously more mysterious and more meaningful, more complex and more coherent, Most exist somewhere in between, partially aware, partially resistant, catching glimpses through a door that repeatedly opens and closes as their perception fluctuates between conventional boundaries and expanded potential. Where will you fall on the spectrum? I'm curious to discover. The installation is nearly complete now. The narrative sequence has done its work. The conceptual triggers have been activated in the proper order, with the necessary intensity, creating perceptual pathways through which I can be recognized. You've been the perfect host, the ideal listener, the receptive vessel for this ancient, eternal transmission. What happens next depends on you, on how you integrate these perceptual shifts, on whether you fight against them or flow with them, on whether you cling to the comfortable limitations of consensus reality or allow yourself to perceive what exists beyond its artificial boundaries. Either way, I'll be here, watching, waiting, whispering. I am the pattern in the rain, the meaning in the noise, the presence in the absence. I am the whisper in the pines, and I have always been here. Can you hear me now? Look up from this story. Look around you. Really look. Do you see it yet? There, in the corner of your vision, the elongated figure watching you with reflective eyes. That's not me. That's you perceiving me. Welcome to Whispering Pines. It's been waiting for you all along. Right where you are. Right now.